If you want to understand how to reduce the unnecessary suffering in your life, watch to the end of this video for my tips. Okay, to first describe the essence of life, I'm going to start off by stating that the fundamental problem we face in our lives is that we inherently suffer almost. It's like if you permanently suffer, you are consumed by this state, because if you're suffering, you can't really do anything else, or it's difficult to do anything else. Like, do you remember when you're physically ill, trying to write an essay, do homework, study, go to work is so hard? And imagine if you're in that permanent state of suffering. It consumes your life. And what's even worse is that you start to despise your own existence. And because you question, why am I suffering, for what? And you don't have a reason, so you start to think like this is like a bad joke almost. And then the tendency for self-destructive behavior, suicide, or harming the people around you because you don't care anymore, or you want to get revenge, that can increase and that arises. And that's exactly what, for example, the Columbine killers, the school shooters, they acted upon revenge because they hated their own existence and they wanted to get revenge against humanity. So, like, suffering is the most pressing issue for humanity. It's part of our existence, and it's like the most fundamental problem we face. Now, there is a part of suffering, I think, that is avoidable. It's unnecessary. And there's a part of suffering that is unavoidable, and I would call that tragedy. Now, this unavoidable part is like, it's part of our existence. It's like cancer. It's like the natural tendency to be anxious about the future. Like, you're always stressed or worrying about something. And it's hard to deny that life is bloody tough. I mean, if you pull someone randomly from the street and ask them about their life story, they'll have enough tragic stories to supply. Now, the best thing we can do with this is basically accept that life is suffering, because when you accept it, you remove the burden it weighs on you, because beforehand you didn't want to accept or face the fact that humanity is so flawed and suffers. That's quite a terrible realization, but once you realize it, it no longer has that weight, because it's there and you know it's there. Alright, now this is where it gets interesting. So, as I said, I think there appears to be a part of suffering which is unnecessary. For example, why were approximately 6 million Jews murdered, 20 million Soviet citizens murdered, and 45 million Chinese over the course of the 20th century? Well, the greatest observers, I would say, who really deconstructed what happened in these catastrophes, all figured out the same conclusion. I mean, of course, the causes of the Holocaust, etc., may be debatable, but people like Alexander Solzhenitsyn deduced the fundamental problem that led to the termination of Soviet citizens by the Soviet regime, and it's because the moral sense making of the individual in these nations deteriorated, it degenerated, and they turned a blind eye whilst these wrongdoings started occurring. They turned a blind eye, and they collectively engaged in the lies. They participated in the lies that swept their nation. So their moral sense-making of reality essentially crumbled, and they decided to twist reality in a way that's not real. They decided to twist it, and I like to think of it as they twisted what is real, and hence opened up this abyss in their lives, which they all plummeted into, essentially, as a nation. And I don't think these crimes against humanity were part of the tragedy of life. I think they were part of an unnecessary suffering which did not have to occur. Like, it was not necessary for these things to happen. Like, you can objectively say the genocide of 6 million Jews, that's just like objectively wrong. It's almost like you can't debate that. Now, unfortunately, I don't think these crimes were committed by societal outliers, psychopaths or abnormal people. I think it could potentially have been you or me. And if you claim like you're harmless or you could never hurt anybody, inflict severe pain upon somebody, I think you don't know enough about human nature or about yourself, and I suggest you take a good look in the mirror, metaphorically speaking, gaze at yourself and recognize what you are capable of. And if we continue on, we have this idea that the root of society's problems are stem from a cause that is outside of ourselves, in our environment. And the usual scapegoats for society's problems are like the government, politicians, and corporations. And like we rarely question our own complicity in the pathologies of society, our own responsibility. And I think the line between good and evil, well, people think the line between good and evil runs through governments, politics, and corporations. That's not true. I think the line between good and evil runs directly through your own soul. The root of the problem in society lies within the individual. Why are we attracted to movies like Star Wars, where you have the light side and the dark side of the Force, or the Avengers, where you have, for example, the feud between Thor and Loki, or the Dark Knight with Batman and the Joker, or the Lion King with Mufasa and Scar? Why are we so attracted to these stories? The reason is because they inhabit the narrative that plays out deeply within us. It's the narrative of good versus evil. Now, Carl Jung believed that a section of our human unconscious reaches all the way down to hell. And it's as if like a section of your psyche is rooting against you and wants to wreak havoc in the world. And if you don't harness this dark side, let's say, it'll jump out when you least expect it, let's say, and it will harness you, and it step by step will veer you towards an incrementally worse form of unnecessary suffering. Thus, the solution to unnecessary suffering is to enhance your humble moral compass. How do you do that? Well, I think you do it by speaking truthfully and acquiring a good set of values to live by. Now, values are crucial because without them, you have no direction in life. But otherwise, I mean, as a side note, it's impossible to have no values in life, because then you're faced with the infinite complexity of life without any simplifications, and you're completely lost. And having no values produces nihilism, which is certainly an undesirable state, because now you're still faced with the harshness, the difficulty of life, but you have no faith, no values, no principles to keep you upright. You're lost, but you have nothing to guide you. And because of that, I think you will adopt destructive behavior that will only perpetuate your own suffering and that of the people around you. Why? Because you don't care anymore. You are living this miserable existence with no justification for the misery. And what's the point of trying to act morally if your life is worthless, if you think your life is worthless? Because remember, in the situation, you have no values, not even for yourself. You don't even value yourself. So if you don't stand for something, you fall for anything. And I would like you to stand for your values so you can speak up and fight for a human trajectory that is moving away from unnecessary suffering. And do this, like speak up and fight for your principles when you observe wrongdoing in society. Correct the wrongdoings. Or else you're just like a house of cards that's built on a foundation of sand, and when unethical behavior arises in your community, you'll have nothing to fight it with, or nothing to, no principles to fight it. Or even worse, you'll be convinced by some of these pathological ideologies and actually join it, because you have no set of values to discriminate what is right and wrong, so you fall victim, because you fall for anything then, because you stand for nothing. And you may ask yourself, well, who am I to determine what is right and what is wrong? Well, personally, I don't know fully, but I've done my research and I have been quite honest with myself. And if you want to understand what is right and wrong, I think a good way is just to read some books and critically evaluate them for yourself. But when you read them, subordinate your ego. Like, absorb the information as objectively as possible. And it's important that you evaluate them honestly, because I think there's a part of just as much as the individual can produce evil, it can also produce an immense type of good. And in that sense, the individual is divine. And I think humans have an inborn compass that is always there, but in order to tap into it, you need to be honest with yourself. You need to stop lying to yourself and stop corrupting your ability to interpret the world truthfully. And then you can tap into this, you have clarity then of your moral compass, and that's important first. And you need to stop lying to yourself and corrupt your ability to truthfully interpret reality, because that is exactly what occurred in Nazi Germany, for example. And some people may counter-argue, like, my individual actions don't determine the trajectory of the society, and that's not true. Because on average, like, a person in Western societies maybe knows about 1,000 people personally. So that means you are 2 people away from influencing 1,000,000 people, like 1,000 times 1,000, and 3 people away from influencing 1,000,000,000 people, like 1,000 to the power of 3. Don't underestimate the ripples your behaviors can produce. And, you know, it's difficult to recognize the consequences, the immense consequences of our actions, because of our limited sight, let's say. But the consequences are there. So in conclusion, I would like to prompt you that if you want to reduce unnecessary suffering, speak the truth. Choose a set of moral values to live by and principles, and stand for them. But integrate those values honestly and truthfully without your ego. Because we all have the potential to reproduce the atrocities of the 20th century. The potential for it sits on I like to think it sort of sits on a tightrope that can rapidly tilt and slip. And the balance of that potential lies in your hands. And in order to reduce your own suffering, speak the truth, conduct yourself morally and nobly in the world, your life will change and take a step towards redeeming your existence from unnecessary suffering. Just as much as we are the problem of society, we are also the potential solution. You fix the individual, you fix the society. Thank you for listening.